Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into how the incredibly turbulent presidency of John Adams served as a massive stress test for the young United States. You know, when we think of the Founding Fathers, we usually picture this unified group of guys working in perfect harmony, right? Well, the reality? It was messy, it was bitter, and it honestly nearly tore the brand new nation apart before it could even fully get off the ground. We're looking at the Adams administration, a period totally defined by international extortion, an undeclared naval war, massive domestic protests, and an election so vicious it literally ended friendships. Let's get right into it.
So how exactly did America's founding friendships turn into such bitter partisan rivalries? Well, to understand how we got to the incredibly fractured election of 1800, we first need to understand the man caught right in the middle of it all. A man whose brilliant legal mind actually helped design the very architecture of the United States.
Section 1. Architect of the Republic.
Long before the bitter partisan wars, John Adams was essentially the engine of the American Revolution. Just take a look at his pre-presidential resume. It proves a fierce, unwavering dedication to the rule of law. Back in 1770, facing intense public backlash, Adams actually defended the British soldiers accused in the Boston Massacre. Why? Because he firmly believed that the rule of law absolutely had to prevail over mob rule. Fast forward to 1776 at the Continental Congress, and he was the loud driving force for independence. And he was self-aware too. Knowing his own unpopularity, he strategically convinced a young Thomas Jefferson to draft the Declaration of Independence. By 1780, he drafted the Massachusetts Constitution, which, amazingly, remains the oldest still-functioning written constitution in the world today. All of this naturally set him up to be elected as the nation's first vice president in 1789.
The guy was a political genius, no doubt about it. In his 1776 pamphlet, Thoughts on Government, Adams laid out the blueprint for a balanced republic. We're talking an executive branch, a bicameral or two-house legislature, and an independent judiciary. His ideas heavily influenced the delegates in Philadelphia a whole decade later. But here's the tragic irony. Despite his brilliant theoretical mind, the practical reality of actually running this new government, it would prove to be an absolute nightmare.
Section 2. The XYZ Affair. Almost the second Adams took office as the second president in 1797, he was hit with a severe international crisis. The French were absolutely furious over the Jay Treaty, which the U.S. had just signed with Great Britain. They viewed it as a total betrayal of their Revolutionary War alliance. So in retaliation, France just starts seizing American merchant ships. What began as a secret diplomatic plot in Paris to resolve this soon blew up into a massive public scandal back home. Adams sent a delegation to France to negotiate peace, hoping to quietly resolve things, but the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, he flat-out refused to meet with them officially. Instead, he sent 3 shadowy intermediaries, who later became known simply as Agents X, Y, and Z. These French agents essentially treated the United States to a geopolitical shakedown. I mean, before any official talks could even begin, X, Y, and Z demanded that the U.S. provide a massive low-interest loan to fund France's European wars, assume the financial claims of American merchants, personally hand Talleyrand a $50,000 bribe, and, get this, have President Adams issue a formal apology. It was pure extortion, just to get a seat at the table. Unsurprisingly, the American diplomats completely rejected the bribe. When Adams went ahead and released these diplomatic dispatches to the public, the nation was outraged. Any pro-fringe sentiment evaporated literally overnight, and suddenly the United States was mobilized for conflict. Millions for defense but not a penny for tribute became this massive rallying cry. It showed the world that America absolutely refused to be bullied. Section 3. The Quasi-War. This total breakdown in talks sparked an undeclared naval conflict that we now call the Quasi-War. By 1798, a staggering 300 American merchant ships had been captured by the French. 300! The economic lifeblood of the brand new nation was under direct attack on the high seas, completely devastating neutral trade. So, facing a very real threat of invasion, Congress rapidly authorized a provisional army of 10,000 men. They actually brought George Washington out of retirement to act as the senior officer. But because of his age, Washington demanded that Alexander Hamilton serve as his second-in-command. This essentially put Hamilton in charge of this massive new force. And wow, did this create a toxic environment. It bred profound mistrust within Adams's own administration, mostly because the president deeply feared Hamilton's soaring military ambitions.
But instead of committing to the massive land war that Hamilton so desperately wanted, Adams decided to push back at sea. He rapidly expanded the Navy, finished constructing heavy frigates, and officially created the Department of the Navy. Through these really aggressive naval actions, American ships successfully repelled French privateers. This ultimately forced France back to the negotiating table without the U.S. ever declaring a full-scale war. This strategic pivot right here is what secured Adams's lasting legacy as the father of the American Navy.
Section 4. Domestic turmoil and rebellion.
Now, all this fear of war abroad quickly translated into severe paranoia and massive political overreach back home. Adams's party, the Federalists, were terrified that French sympathizers and recent immigrants were actively working to undermine the government from the inside. So, completely ignoring First Amendment principles, the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts to crush dissenting speech. The Sedition Act literally made it a crime to publish malicious writing against the government. And in a moment of deep historical irony, James Madison, the very father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights, was so horrified by this alongside Thomas Jefferson that they secretly drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. They actually argue that states could nullify these unconstitutional federal laws.
And the domestic issues didn't stop there. To fund that military buildup we just talked about, Congress passed a highly unpopular progressive tax on land value in 1798. Out in Pennsylvania, rural German-speaking farmers viewed this as a direct threat to their liberties. Led by a man named John Fries, they violently chased off the tax collectors. Hamilton, jumping at the chance, immediately marched the army in to crush the rebellion. But then Adams stepped in a move that showcased his fierce independent streak and completely infuriated his own political party. President Adams pardoned Fries. He saw these men as misguided rather than truly treasonous.
Naturally, this crisis fractured the Federalist Party from the inside out. Adams deeply resented Hamilton's behind-the-scenes influence over his cabinet. He genuinely feared Hamilton was trying to use that provisional army to set himself up as some sort of military dictator. You can actually feel Adams's visceral disgust in his writings, where he paints Hamilton as a conceited and highly dangerous mortal.
And it wasn't just John. First Lady Abigail Adams, who was a powerful political partner and really a stateswoman in her own right, was even more blunt in her distrust. Abigail was John's closest advisor. Honestly, critics even derisively called her Mrs. President because of her influence. She was a fierce defender of her husband's administration and passionately opposed anyone who threatened it, particularly Hamilton. She viewed him as a dangerous, ambitious, basically a second Caesar.
Section 5. The Election of 1800. All of this domestic and international turmoil finally collided in the election of 1800. It was a bitter, bitter rematch between Adams and his former friend Thomas Jefferson. The country was an absolute powder keg at this point. This head-to-head matchup represented two fundamentally different visions for the future of the Republic. You had Adams and the Federalists, who believed in a strong central authority to maintain order. Then you had Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, who feared centralized power and championed states' rights and the agrarian farmer. And the campaign? It was incredibly dirty. The partisan press launched vicious, highly personal attacks on both men.
The country split fiercely along both geographic and economic lines. The commercial elites were backing Adams and the Federalists, while the yeoman farmers threw their support behind Jefferson. In the end, largely due to the sheer unpopularity of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the heavy taxes, and that completely splintered Federalist Party, Jefferson defeated Adams. It was a crushing, humiliating blow for the incumbent president.
Yet, even in electoral defeat, Adams managed to secure a massive, strategic, long-term victory. In the final waning days of his presidency, Adams rushed to fill newly created judicial seats with Federalist loyalists. These were the so-called midnight judges. Most crucially of all, he appointed John Marshall as Chief Justice. This singular, brilliant move would fundamentally shape American constitutional law, keeping Federalist ideology alive and asserting the power of the Supreme Court for decades after the Federalist Party itself had completely disappeared.
Now, Jefferson did try to mend this bitter divide in his inaugural address, famously stating, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." Though it's worth noting Adams had already quietly slipped out of town before the ceremony even began. But the profound truth here is that the peaceful transfer of power from one rival political party to another was absolutely revolutionary for its time. It proved that the constitutional framework Adams had helped design could actually withstand intense political warfare. So as we look at the deeply polarized political climate of today, we really have to ask ourselves this final, lasting question about the legacy of our founding. If they couldn't avoid it, can we? John Adams's presidency shows us that extreme partisanship, fear-mongering, and foreign interference, they aren't new inventions. They were present at the very creation of the United States. Yet, the Republic survived, the institutions held,
And perhaps that is the most important lesson we can take from the tumultuous, truly remarkable term of our second president. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shaped us.